Professors, educators, lecturers, invited speakers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, warm greetings from Vietnam. It's nice to see you all from around the world in the International Conference on Learning Transversal Competencies in ASEAN countries and their neighbors. We are very eager to listen to the presentations of eminent professors, invited speakers, ideas and visions, as well as profound discussions on transversal competencies. It's great to know that you are healthy and safe during the pandemic. I would like to introduce to you some of our speakers for our conference today. Ms. John Bernard, Spectacle Learning. Professor James Williams from George Washington University. Ms. Joy Pangilinan, Department of Education, the Philippines. Mr. Jiwanath Sharma from Bhutan. Catherine Anderson Levitt from University of Michigan, Dearborn. Professor Aaron Banavot from University of Albany, State University of New York. Mr. John Jiao from Impact Singapore. Yuto Kitamura from University of Tokyo. Ori Sasaki from Kaichi International University. Professor Esther Kerr, University of Melbourne.
Good morning.
Mikiko Nishimura from International Christian University, Tokyo. And Ms. Joan G. De Jager, University of Minnesota.
Good morning.
Morning. And from the organizing committee, Vietnam National Institute of Educational Sciences and Networking to Integrate SDG Target 4.7 and Soft Skills into Educational Materials. Joining the conference are a number of researchers, scholars, and experts. Please deliver our sincere welcome to our international and national guests. And now, let me introduce Professor Lê Anh Vinh, Director General of the Vietnam National Institute of Educational Sciences, to deliver his opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. Distinguished guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to warmly welcome you all to the International Conference on the Learning Transversal Competencies in ASEAN countries and their neighbors, co-hosted by VNIS, the Vietnam National Institute of Educational Science, and NISEMS, the Networking to Integrate the SDG Targets 4.7 and Social-Emotional Learning Skill into Educational Materials. This conference is a very important event for VNIS when we celebrate the 60th anniversary this year, the 6th of December 1961, the 6th of December 2021. And it's also the final and the most important conference in a series of the 15 conference that we organize this year, ranging from a national conference to evaluate Vietnam education in the period 2011-2020. The specific conference on preschool for general education, for high school, higher education as well. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in a world in which the technologies is in the forefront of change and the technological innovation are the driving force. It is not easy to predict for the futures, but we are certain that the technologies will continue to play the key role in shaping the world that we live, we play, and we learn. So we need to prepare for our kids for the futures. As the saying goes, time and time wait for the no man. We must continue to innovate and build our skill so we can keep up with the latest development and benefit from the technological advance. How we can have the young, the youth to become ready for the futures is not an easy question to answer. We will need to develop the attitudes and the skill beyond the knowledge. We will need to focus on the competitive, advance, and our human strengths. It will be the ability to build a relationship with one another, to collaborate and work in teams, to be able to think creatively, to keep on learning, to challenge one another, to develop a better solution together. The transversal skills may sound like the most natural things that everyone should have and should be able to do, but they need to be practiced continuously. Education policymaker in the ASEAN regions has already promoted for integrations, inclusion of the 21st century skill, including the social and emotional learning in practice. However, translating the policy into practice is not an easy task for anyone. Given the content of the schooling usually surrounding the academic subjects, the exam is to heavily emphasize in the school structures. Not only the teacher preparation and ongoing support is important, but the communities and the parents need to engage to ensure that the curriculum reforms for the transversal competencies really benefit their children. One of the key change in the classroom is to work with the teachers and work with the curriculums and the textbook developers to embed the new policies goes into the learning research at all levels of the schooling. Exchange of the experience among ASEAN countries in this aspect of the textbook reform and the assessment strategies related to the 21st century skill can help the country to prepare for the challenge and the opportunities of the coming decades. And we have to say the assessment of the non-academic competencies requires a new approach. And I hope that it also be one of the topics that we will discuss in this conference today. Ladies and gentlemen, in order to integrate the transversal competencies in the school practice and to build up a future-ready communities, to initiate exchange experience about the 21st century travel skill among the ASEAN countries, the Vietnam National Institute of Educational Science, and the networking to integrate SDG targets 4.7 and social emotional learning skill into educational material co-host this international conference. The conference today has twofold purpose. First, this conference will serve as a platform for the international and regional experts to discuss, to share the experience on the integration of transversal skill in education to address the skill gap in ASEAN regions and their neighbors. Second, the conference discussion will open up the idea for future cooperation in order to propose the strategies and the approach in upskilling the transversal competency in ASEAN region and their neighbors. The initial plan, we would like to organize this as an offline event to celebrate the 60th anniversary of Venice. Unfortunately, the COVID situation is not going to be better very soon. So we have to switch to the fully online mode of the conference. This conference co-host between Venice and NISEMS, we plan to organize annually. So we hope to welcome you all for the next conference in 2020. And we hope that at this time, the COVID situation will be much better. So taking this opportunity, I would like to express my thanks to all the experts, the presenter, educator, and the teachers for supporting Venice and NISEMS in our efforts to organize this meaningful conference. With that, I would like to declare the opening of the conference learning transversal competencies in ASEAN countries and their neighbors. I wish all of you success and happiness, and hopefully the conference will be the forum for the fruitful discussion to promote the learning transversal in the school practice in the ASEAN regions and the neighbors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ding, for your speech. And it's time for photo section. So I would like to ask all of our guests to turn on the camera. Okay, on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Thank you, everyone. And I will not waste any more of your time. So let's just jump right into our section. The theme of our first section is Rethinking 21st Century Skills. And our moderator is Miss Jean Bernard from Spectacle Learning Media. So please, Miss Jean, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, or evening, and welcome to this first session of this truly international conference. The topic of this session is Rethinking 21st Century Skills, and will feature the first keynote speaker of the conference, Professor Kaiming Cheng, I hope he's here, of the University of Hong Kong. My name is Jean Bernard, and I'm one of the co-conveners of NISEM, which, as you have said, stands for Networking to Integrate Sustainable Development Goal Target 4.7 and Social Emotional Learning into Educational Materials, which is a very long name for a group with a very specific focus. And on behalf of NISEM, I would like to thank the Vietnam National Institute for Educational Studies for the privilege of co-hosting this wonderful event. So before we begin, I would just like to take a minute to explain how I hope the session will unfold. Following Professor Cheng's keynote address, we will hear from 2 discussants, Mr. Giwanat Sharma, who is a seasoned educator in Bhutan, and Joan de Jager, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who is Professor of Comparative and International Development at the University of Minnesota, here in the USA, which is where I'm speaking from as well, and co-leader of the RISE research team for Vietnam, RISE. To all participants, as you listen, I encourage you to engage by placing your questions and comments for Dr. Cheng and or for the discussants in the Q&A space at any time. And we will get to as many of these as we possibly can toward the end of the session in the last 15 minutes. So without further ado, we are exceptionally fortunate to have Professor Kaiming Cheng with us to open this first session. Trained as a mathematician, he began his career as a school teacher and principal before pursuing doctoral studies at the London Institute of Education. His long, and I think we can say truly illustrious career has spanned the distance between East and West, as well as between North and South, having done research in rural areas in China, India, and Africa, and having spent 10 years teaching at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, in addition to institutions of higher learning in China and Russia, among others. He's also no stranger to Southeast Asia, having recently undertaken a World Bank project with teacher training universities in Vietnam, and has worked with most of the big international organizations, if not all. His focus of attention in these endeavors is on changes in society and their impact on education. I think it's fair to say that the first 2 decades of the 21st century have brought very, very momentous, if not seismic changes, many of them unforeseen. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing Professor Cheng's take on how these skills, which were conceptualized in perhaps more optimistic times at the end of the 20th century, have been interpreted, rethought, and restructured in the wake of these recent changes and challenges as we move forward into uncharted waters. And so I'm pleased now to pass the floor to Professor Kaiming Cheng.
So before Professor Cheng, he's going to join us in several minutes because he has technical issues a little bit. So before we listen to the presentation from Professor Cheng, I just want to remind you about how can we have the Q&A sessions. So you can see we have two categories. First is about the chat box, but you should not have time to. You should not send the questions in the chat box. You should send questions in the Q&A. Yeah. So now Professor Cheng is he is now available. So please, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important conference. And also, I have to thank those who are not in the right time zone and they have to perhaps wake up in the very early morning. Let me share my PowerPoint and express my own observations of the topic. My topic is rethinking 21st century skills. And let me start by saying that I have mottos for myself. The first is the ultimate aim of education is students' future. I suppose nobody will object. And the second, the core business of education is students' learning. So one of them is macro, about society. And the other one is micro, about individuals. Transversal learning, I started using that term in UNESCO Bangkok, 2013. And it was an incident where UNESCO Bangkok invited many countries to submit their reports about the state of transversal learning in their own jurisdictions. I used this PowerPoint at that time because there are silos of subjects, academic disciplines. But then there are also the 5 so-called competencies. In that time, it was called non-cognitive competencies used by UNESCO at that time. I said they are running across all these disciplines. They are not silos. Therefore, I call them transversal competencies. It's not a very precise term, but it does give us some idea of where this learning comes into play. Noticeably, one, it is about learning experiences. If you look at, it's about learning experiences. And it's about education. It's about individuals learning. And it's not quite the same as competencies. And that will be almost the main theme of my presentation this morning. I made an analysis of a spectrum of so-called transversal competencies from the 10 jurisdiction reports. And it's from very concrete, very tangible to less tangible, more concrete, less concrete to more abstract. Spirituality is, for example, is not in every country. It's only in the Philippines, but it's written in their education documents. You see at the bottom are work-related attributes. And then human relations on job, human relations beyond job, that is families, society, community. And more, it is about individuals, how individuals position themselves in society, in community, in workplace, and so on and so forth. I tried to make an analysis and found that there are three kinds of discourse among all these attributes. One is economic discourse, which is well understood. Another is social discourse. It's about community, society, harmony. And then the last one is humanity discourse, which is about individuals, how individuals cultivate themselves. Now, this is almost a kind of a overture. So my first question is 21st century skills. Why is it necessary? Why is it necessary? If it is all the way among us in education, in our thinking, why should we raise it again? It's 21st century. And my understanding is learning is a human instinct. I suppose you all believe that babies learn by themselves. They learn language and movements sooner or later. But education is not. Education is a system learning of learning designed by human beings for human beings. And yes, but what is that? It means that education is always underpinned with the economic, political, social, cultural, and spiritual context of the time. And it really means that the design could be obsolete. The contexts have changed, then the assumptions, the design could be obsolete. That means education could be obsolete. I'm afraid that I'm thinking that we are at this historical juncture where education has to change because of change in society. Now, here's an illustration. Bear with me. What are these? Where? What do you see?
Boxes.
Shoes, right? Shoes. Where are these shoes? Shoe shop? No. It is a middle-income, middle-aged Hong Kong male at his home in Canada. Right? And you think this is amazing? Very often when I start a meeting everywhere, I start asking the audience, how many pairs of shoes do you have at home? And people laughed. At first, it were the ladies who laughed. Now all young people laugh because they collect ball shoes, sport shoes. Do they want so many shoes, so many pairs of shoes? No. And why are they buying them? So I come to this observation that production is no longer for satisfying needs. Mass production is a poison for the market. You have a Louis Vuitton handbag, $1 million flooding the market. Who will buy it? Economy of scale? Not so much, because every shop, every project, a product has to classify themselves in order to attract customers. Therefore, the need for huge pyramidal bureaucracies are diminishing. Instead, it's creating desire for production, is producing less quantity, more variety, is customizing, individualizing, personalizing products, is moving towards one-stop services, one-stop shops, rather than huge layers of bureaucracy, because it's no longer necessary. And people are working in smaller and flatter and fragile units. And that affects people's jobs. And in a way, there's a study work mismatch in almost all universities. In my own university, with the exception of medicine, even engineering, 1/3 of the graduates never entered engineering. Do you think it's a waste? No, that's a reality, because people change their minds, the workplace has changed, the profession has changed, and why couldn't we allow people to change their minds? But the change of mind doesn't stop at graduation. Frequent change of jobs change of occupations, slashers, that is working on many jobs at one time, self-employed, freelancing, no employer, intermittent jobless, voluntary, go to tours, go to services in Africa, early retirement, fluctuating income, insecure position, and so on and so forth. I think if you talk to young people, they are facing this. It really tell me that it's a fragmented society. Units are getting smaller and smaller. Individuals are free because they are no longer bound by an organization so much, and they are no longer bound by an occupation. But they are insecure. They face a reality which is, we all know, VUCA society, and which means the 21st century is really not the same as the 21st century is not the same as 20th century. And that is why we need to talk about the 21st century. And it's not just an ideal. It's a very pragmatic move to face the reality. Now let us start with the US 21st century skills, which is the main theme of my presentation. This is perhaps known to everybody. Now, this is the produced by the US as Y first century, 21st century skills to produce effective citizens, workers, and leaders, right? For rigorous high education coursework, okay, career challenges, and global competitive workforce. So it's really about performance. My second question is, does 21st century skills include values? The 21st century skills, the soft skills, consist of 3 dimensions. The 4 C's, about digital literacy, which is very much prompted by technology, career and life, right? Do skills include values? That's a question. Argument 1, yes. I heard from some other cultures that values are no more than knowledge and skills. It's either hard skills or soft skills. In other cultures, the argument is no, because skills are about high or low ability, inability, but values are about right or wrong, good or bad, beautiful, ugly, and so on and so forth. I wouldn't say which one is right or wrong, because they belong to 2 different ways of interpreting skills and interpreting cultures. My further question is, in the case of soft skills, do they represent values? That is, if you have the soft skills, then you have values. You know how to communicate, you have the values. You are responsible, you have the values. Let us turn to Singapore as an alternative. This is Singapore's 21st century competencies. The term is changed, but there's a substance in the change. First of all, the skills, you will notice, are not very different from the soft skills in the American framework. So there's no difference. So if the skills and attributes are more or less the same, how is it different? Then if you notice that in the middle, there's a core values, which is the 6 core values, which is in the national document in Singapore. And meanwhile, they surround the skills with 4 types of people, persons. And this is actually part of their desired outcomes of education. The education desire is about people. Therefore, these 4 types of people. Does it mean that Singapore does not pay attention to skills? No, not at all. There's a tremendous endeavor of Skills Future, very famous, but it is a rather different enterprise. I won't go into it. So it's people as the ultimate aim of education with skills. And this is I wouldn't elaborate in that. My question is, okay, if you have values, you treasure values, but is education responsible only for performance? That is, apart from performance, who is responsible? Could it be the church? Could be the family or the workplace? So my fundamental question is a knowledgeable and skillful person all that we want? This is my fundamental question, right? I might be wrong, but from the framework of the US 21st century skills, it's basically about knowledge and skills, a performing person. This is what we have in Hong Kong in 2016. We talk about, it's a revisit of educational aims after a reform which started in 1999, about 17 years later. We found that we have to turn to people's quality at 3 levels. One is capability, which is more or less what we call hard skills. The second one is attributes, which is about how you deal with people, how you deal with work, about soft skills. But then there's also a 3rd level, values. Love and care, integrity, justice, and so on and so forth, right? So it's a different way of interpreting what education is about. Here, values is part of the responsibility of education. So my question is education responsible for developing values? And one may say, no, education is basically about skills, and values has to be developed elsewhere. Then I encountered this question when I attended a conference in a debate in Taiwan, where the chairman of the Academia Sinica chaired. They said skills and competencies are about performance as output. Education is also about a person's intrinsic quality. This is what they say. And they can't find a translation. So they use the term 素养, which I wouldn't be able to translate. It's about intrinsic quality of a person. This is a very traditional way of looking at a person and education. So they come up to their 21st century competencies or 21st century 素养. As arranged by God in the same year, 2016, with no communication at all, mainland Chinese produced a same kind of a circle, also called it 素养, and it's about 4 dimensions, 3 dimensions: self-management, knowledge and culture. Culture means softer side of knowledge, and social participation. But in the middle is the notion of a comprehensive development of a person. The notion is comprehensive development of a person. What I have observed from all these different ways of looking at 21st century skills. Observation 1, there is, to me, a cultural difference. Howard Gardner, who is famous for multiple intelligences, in 1984 wrote about there are 3 realms about key competencies in different societies. All societies have to face that. First is the physical world. Second is the world of man-made artifacts, example, tools. And third is the social world. Apparently, there are different emphases in different cultures about these three realms when you talk about key competencies. So there could be some semantic differences because of the culture. Meaning of competencies, for example, in some cultures, in culture X, is about hard skills plus soft skills. In some cultures, for example, in Europe, they talk about knowledge and skills and attitudes. And in Chinese communities, it's a very ancient way of looking at education. Is 5 dimensions: moral, intellectual, physical, social, and aesthetic. Different ways of looking at competencies. There's a basic difference between emphasis on performance and emphasis on people. There are treasures in cultural traditions in every culture, and they are resurfacing because of changing society. Because now it's no longer enough just to have credentials and employment. Second, I think it's a matter of discourse. Since the Second World War, there's an economic discourse on education with the human capital theory. And every country now is going to spend, they are willing to spend money on education because it's an investment. It's no longer a consumption. You invest money, you pay, you put resources into education, you get rewarded in your GDP, in your global competitiveness. For the nation, it's for growth, for competitiveness. For individuals, it's about credentials, which will lead you to employability, and then better education will give you better performance, right? It's an economic discourse, right? When I first started my study in London about education, it's about education planning. And the first thing to learn is about manpower planning, right? It's turning human beings into human resources. However, the reality has changed. The economic discourse, which has served education well since the World War II, does not seem adequate for the 21st century because individuals are facing a totally different world. There's a wake-up call. 2016, there is a call from a professor in Harvard called Making Caring Common, where he advocated that 50% of university admissions criteria should be on caring. And he has a very elaborate scheme to make that happen. I called him and asked him, I said, do you think this will have any echo? He gave me a list. There was already almost 300 universities echoing. Now you will turn the page on Making Caring Common, you will see almost 1,000 universities echoing. I'm not so sure it's really carried out, but it's true that many leading universities are no longer looking only at scores. We owe our students learning in the affective domain. This is by Bloom taxonomy, cognitive, affective, psychomotor, or we call it transversal learning. We have to move away from a purely economic discourse. Economic discourse is, yes, it is nothing wrong with it, but we can't purely develop education according to economic considerations. But third observation, that learning in the affective domain is already happening. Transversal learning is already happening. Although Nissan is advocating that, but it is a reflection of the real happening in society in various jurisdictions. Young people are moving fast. Educators are moving fast. Society is also moving fast. They don't wait for policymakers. Very few countries, very few jurisdictions, very few governments take transversal learning as the major goal of education. I give you examples. Young people, we are facing a non-materialistic generation, as it said. They don't care about salaries or status. There's a talk about mission over major. This is from American paper. Values over promotion in the workplace. Lying flat. This is in mainland China. Young people don't want to. Young people don't want to climb the ladder. They want to do something else. They call it 躺平, lying flat. So they are moving fast. Educators are also moving fast. From Hong Kong, I can see initiatives from everywhere from the world coming to Hong Kong. Social emotional learning, character education, positive education, mindfulness, student well-being, wellness, growth mindset, and so on and so forth. I must have missed a lot. Even during the pandemic. See, even during the pandemic with no physical community, through virtual platforms. And society can also move very fast. This is in Hong Kong. In 2016, we made a survey. There are, in an average of all primary and secondary schools, 13.3 projects, which are partnering with community organizations. They could be commercial firms, they could be government departments, they could be NGOs, they could be fraternity organizations, religious bodies, and so on and so forth, right? It's not about, it's a whole variety of activities. Many of them are not academic. It's about flying a plane, it's about rugby, it's about African tam-tam drums, and so on and so forth. Enormous resources. They are all voluntary. And beyond schools, beyond the formal curriculum. It is happening. It can happen anywhere. So transversal learning is learning through experience in the community, because schools can only play the hub. Schools cannot provide all these resources and opportunities. They have to be provided by the community. We call it a big education. That is, everybody cares about students. It's not only a matter of the Ministry of Education, or it is not only a matter of the government. It has to happen. Our motto is it has to happen despite the government. Right? And it's echoing OECD's recent 4 scenarios of schooling. The first one is traditional. The second one is school as a learning hub. Yes, it's a hub, but it is a broker, it's a merchandiser in a way. Education outsourced because it's all in society and learning everywhere. It says learn as you go. And we are doing that actually in our daily life. All these are happening gradually, simultaneously. It reminds me that there could be nothing new except that we didn't pay too much attention. OECD has these 4 pillars of learning: learning to know, learning to do, learning to live together, learning to be. Right? It's beyond the academic curriculum, it's beyond credentials. OECD, the first one was UNESCO. 1997 started this DESICO and it's revised several times. On DESICO means definition and selection of competencies. 3 dimensions: interact in heterogeneous groups about people, act autonomously about yourself, your planning, your protection, and also use tools interactively about work, right? So these are there. But let me wrap up by quoting from Pope Francis very recently, when he addressed the Swedish Academy in November 19th. The world needs a culture of an encounter that can open a way for respectful dialogue that doesn't resort to hostility. So transversal learning is not only for individual survival and thrive, and to survive and to thrive, or to become leaders, yes, but it is also, you look at the macro picture, the world is full of hostility. The world is full of hatred. I don't think the world can carry on like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And now I'd like to, there's so much to unpack here. I'd like to turn to our discussants to have them raise their first questions for you. First, Mr. Giwadat Sharma from Bhutan. Are you with us? Giwadat?
Yes, hello.
Yes.
Hello.
Good morning, and thank you, professors, for the whole package there. It's a bombshell, and you have really unpacked a lot of things from all around the world. It's so heartening to listen to you and see how the world is evolving and changing from one way of thinking to another over the century. And so it's really heartening to see that. I just picked a few things from what we do out here in our country. So I just want to catch that and then see how it can be correlated to what Professor brought out here. As introduced by Jean, I'm Giwanath. I'm basically an educator in Bhutan. I'm also a mathematics background person. So I think Professor Cheng and me can link, connect ourselves on that line. In Bhutan, what we are basically doing is our vision of education is to create an educated and enlightened society of our national aspiration of development, that is gross national happiness, built and sustained on the unique Bhutanese values. We call it Thadamtsi, which again is loosely translates to integrity. And the other one is Lejuti, which again loosely translates to cause. Basing our education to those two values. And then we are targeting to achieve this vision through, again, 5 areas of development, which Professor talked about. I think it quite relates to the Chinese thing, that is, we will write as physical, cerebral, social, emotional, and spiritual. And then also they are similar to some of the frameworks that Professor has shown there. We have also seen that in your presentation from a global perspective, we know that education is underpinned with economic, political, social, cultural, spiritual aspirations or beliefs. So in your view, Professor, are there certain good human characteristics that are shared or that can be among all the cultures? In other words, are there certain values that we might be able to consider universal or should be part of, for example, education for the global citizenship? Professor talked about Pope Francis' dialogue about the need for culture of encounter so that we could have a respectful dialogue. So is that, in that matter, can we have some universal framework based on, so a universal framework based on which countries can contextualize their educational approach? I think we are more moving from the material to the human, about the human being evolving and realizing their potential, and not so much on material aspect. And so from that lens, what would be your view on having a universal thing and then having an umbrella sort of a thing from which cultures can contextualize as per their need? Thank you.
Oh, thank you for the question. It's a big question. It's a century question. I don't pretend I can answer the question. However, I do think that moving away, the first step is to move away from a purely economic discourse. But then, more recently, there is also a political discourse. That is, everything is colored by politics. And among educators, when I move around to different countries, we don't have barriers at all. We are talking about the same thing. When you talk about science of learning, for example, all human beings learn more or less the same, right? It is I think the globalization is now meeting some challenge. Personally, I think globalization is almost a must. We are all human beings. Why should we divide among ourselves? However, I have to say politicians are moving behind the time. They are trying to put the clock back into a divided world, in a world of hostility, a world of wars, world of hatred. And well, I'm not so sure history will repeat itself, right? When you look at the past, when I travel in many countries, all the landscape kind of icons are due to war, either due to colonial war or internal war or religious war. And are human beings meant to kill each other? No, I think we are not here. We all know this is not the case, should not be the case. So I think transversal learning, although it can be seen as a small part of education, I would say it is more or less the underpinning factor for all education. Science may change, knowledge may change, but human nature should be common and there should be possibility of interflow. And listening to you, I'm reminded of this, what do you call that? The scale of happiness. What is
Gross national happiness.
Yeah. I'm really amazed when I hear your colleagues presenting a scale. Yes, a happiness scale. And I think, well, I have to stop here because I don't think I pretend that I have the answer, but I think asking this question is very important.
Yes.
Thank you.
Agree.
Thank you.
Yes. So can we turn to Professor Jaeger, or help me pronounce your name?
Joan de Jaeger. So thank you.
De Jaeger. Thank you.
Thanks, Nissim and Venice for having me as a discussant, and Professor Cheng. This is really quite an honor for me to engage with your presentation and to think about it and to ask questions, in part because I actually found myself reading through your paper and your presentation and really agreeing with you. So when one agrees, you have to think about your questions carefully. Partly to say a little bit where I come from. First, as I was introduced, I actually co-lead a research project on the education system in Vietnam. And part of what we've been looking at over the last 6 years, this is funded by the RISE organization of the UK, and Australia is also funding it. Part of what we've been looking at is the competency-based curriculum and reforms, even prior to the most latest version of that, that are being implemented. But I've also been working on this issue of competencies and life skills much before even working in this project in Vietnam. So I guess my comments and questions are really much broader than the Vietnam piece. My colleagues are actually going to be presenting on that later today. I have been working on a book with colleagues where we just actually came out this week, so it's timely. It's called Life Skills for Young Adults. And we're looking at a lot of these questions around life skills and critical perspectives about how they're being taught. And so one of the things that we say in that book, and I guess I just want to put out there why I agree with you, is we talk about life skills as being necessary to live life well. So it goes well beyond the economic realm that you're talking about. And what does it mean then to live life well, right? What kinds of attitudes, skills, values, identities do we need to cultivate for living life well? And you pose this question, right? Do skills include values? And I think it's a really important question. And I hope my internet is okay, because I'm getting a message that it's not. So I hope you can hear me okay.
It's fine, yes.
But
don't
so
believe it.
I think we need to recognize that all of our education is value laden. And it's not value free, no matter if we're talking about technical work-oriented skills. I mean, take this example you posed even from the Singaporean model of teaching responsible decision-making. Well, what makes up responsible decision-making to be a citizen in Singapore clearly may indicate something quite different than what it may mean to be a responsible citizen where I reside here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And these are contested all the time among groups of people. And people hold very different values of what our society should be, what our cultural identity, what our national identities should be, right? So I just, given that we hold these many different values, and yet our education implicitly and explicitly teaches them, and you talked about how our teachers and our students in some ways are ahead of the politics and policymakers. And I agree that much of that is happening, but I'm wondering if you would say more about how teachers could teach values better without imposing one set of values on another. Because in the US, you talk to teachers and they don't want to teach values. Their hands, they don't, but they're implicitly teaching values all the time, right? And we know that there are many disputes in our school systems today over values. Even teaching science in the school system is extremely value laden and debated. So I just wonder if you could say more specifically about what we can do about teaching values. I have my own ideas and would think about some ways to do that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm totally with you that even values are not mentioned in any document or in the curriculum. It is implicitly there. And when teachers teach, I study the mathematics and physics, and they're full of values there, right? You know, even in mathematics, there is a small literature on ethnomathematics. There's different ethnic groups around the world. There are different ways of looking at mathematics, different ways of looking at number, different ways of looking at shapes, and so on and so forth. But values, unfortunately, are not always taught. I think people have to pick up values in their experience. And that's the difficult part of it. There are cultures in which we believe that values can be imported into your brain, right? You call it indoctrination, but indoctrination perhaps is too negative a term. But actually, it's a matter of enculturation. In my experience, students pick up their values from the family, from their peers, from school culture, from teachers' role model. And now, increasingly more, from the virtual society. And that is one thing that we educators know very little. That is how students shape their thinking about society, about human beings, about work, about future, not from us. There's a reason, you know, in Hong Kong is suffering from social unrest in 2019. And I'm reviewing some of the research reports on the causes. And it is almost point to the direction that young people live in their virtual society more than the physical society. Not in terms of time, but in terms of the intensity. in terms of what influence that is. And very unfortunately, our classrooms are basically pretending it is value free. But in the social media, it is value laden, heavy value laden. It is always leading people to believe this is right, this is wrong, and you have to hate the other side, and so on and so forth. And now I'm not trying to say that schools can do nothing, but it's very complex. And so I would like to hear more about what you think about how values can be well, I wouldn't say can be developed and because it happens in individual brains. This is what I learned from the science of learning, and therefore it's difficult to control. I must say, it's not a controlled engineering process. Nonetheless, you have to create the ecology for the value to develop. But once you create an ecology, it is already laden with value, and that is the dilemma. But fortunately, unfortunately, we have to live with that. It's not a very optimistic answer, I'm afraid.
May I just add? I think I appreciate your comments because one, first of all, that it isn't just about teaching, it is about a socialization or an enculturation process that's well beyond teachers. And I like the term you just used now about an ecology, because we exist. And you used in your talk this economic discourse, and then the social discourse, and then the humanity discourse. And yet I think what's interesting, as you pointed out, part of the ecology now is a very non-human virtual ecology that young people are really learning and living in this, in social media and in the virtual world. So for me, I guess, I think of it as a relation. I think of learning these competency skills relationally. That means putting people always in relation to others and non-humans as well, in how they think about and learn in this world. And I think we need to do a better job of that. And yet so many of when we look at these frameworks around skills, whether it's life skills, social emotional skills, etc., so many of them, as you pointed out, are individualized. Self-esteem, self-confidence, self-motivation, right? And not that the individual isn't important, but the individual is always situated in relation to humans and the non-human world. So I think we just need to do a better job at that. And I think I really appreciated the end of your presentation, where you also showed how these sort of competencies and values and identities are learned in communities, in these ecologies. So thank you for that.
Not necessarily in schools.
You remind me that perhaps when we talk about values, education, learning about values, maybe that we should do some categories, some ladder. Some of them are like what Dr. Sharma said is common, right? About self-confidence, human happiness, although they are value laden still, but there are values which are touching about other people. Then it's at second level. There could be values that will affect the whole community. There could be values that would be national, and so on and so forth. If we can have that kind of categorization, then we know our position as educators, things that we cannot go too deep into, but things we definitely have to do. I'm not so sure that is the direction. Let us work together in NISAM and to work out a framework of values learning, values education. I don't think we can have achieve it in one go, but unless you start somewhere, it's a long journey. Unless you start somewhere, it will never happen. Otherwise, we will always struggling with values education as a token. But what do you mean by that values education, right? The neuroscience in learning mathematics, learning language is very developed, at least for the lower age, younger age. But the neuroscience for in the affective domain is just beginning. There's a community working on that. We may collaborate with them, but that is more about the process. The aim of values education, the target goal of value education is value laden, unfortunately. Yeah.
We have a question from Miss Suan from VNIES, who says, thank you, Dr. Cheng, for posing a very interesting question. Do skills include values? I think not all skills do, but at least soft skills definitely have strong relation to values. And from my both observation and readings, I guess values will be something like guiding principles for individuals to develop their skills. So what do you think of that idea of values as guiding principles?
Now, let me give you very simply in seconds, my understanding of culture. There are 7 levels. The first one is language and artifacts. The second one is ceremonies and rituals. The third one is about heroes and metaphors. These belong to the art or kind of visible. And then the next 3 levels are about behavioral norms. That is, things are not governed by law, but everybody thinks that this is right. Shared values. This touches upon what we are talking about. And then basic assumptions. Right? Do you assume that your neighbor is an enemy, or do you assume that the rules are more important than friendship, and so on and so forth? And then the last one is about basic methodology. And here is where I use it to analyze our 21st century skills. That is, there are cultures which emphasize on tools, others on people. Some emphasize on the analytic way of looking at things. Others emphasize on the holistic way of looking at things, and so on and so forth. And so I think Xuan's point is valid, of course, because when I do this classification, I don't pretend that they are distinct levels, layers. They are all intertwined. They are all intertwined. And yes, and that is the complexity of education. When people compare education with engineers, with medical doctors, I think it is pretty unfair, because we are facing human beings which are very individual, and what we are dealing with is a very complex issue.
And we have one question, only one question in the Q&A from the participants so far, but I think we're coming fairly close to the end of our session, so let me get this one in. Is there any program supporting the young generation in the ASEAN region to bring them together that allows them to be something on the same scale of countries banding together in the ASEAN region? Or even themselves? Do you have any suggestions for them? I guess groups of younger people, bringing them together. It reminds me of a thought I had when you were talking about the world full of conflict, hate, and so on. That there is this movement among the younger generation now, especially in the areas of climate action. There's an activist. In the US here, it's called something like wokeness. So is there anything similar to that going on that you know of in the Southeast Asian region, that or in East Asia in general, that it supports this kind of positive movement that may or may not be the result of education?
Me? Okay.
Yes.
Again, I don't pretend I have an answer, but I think there are 2 ways of looking at harmony. One is to build consensus. Everybody thinks the same, which I don't think will happen. The other one is to understand each other, to tolerate each other, to understand that things could be different. And I think that is something that could be done. And the ASEAN countries, for the time being, are mutually friendly to each other, basically, compared to other parts of the world. So it's not impossible to allow young people to understand each other. One thing that could be done, which is not happening so much because of pandemic, the notion of overseas studies is deteriorating. It's disruption. But within Asian countries, ASEAN countries, can we not actually produce some mutual visits when, of course, when the pandemic is slightly over, to understand each other with with an open mind to understand others. I understand about 10 years ago, there's a project in Malaysia which allows people from different religions to understand other religions. And that is so important, important, because if you don't understand, you take it as enemy easily and be easily stirred to become hostile. So I think mutual understanding, global understanding, perhaps is a starting point for young people, so that when they grow up, at least they have the understanding that these are not aliens. These are just like us. I think that kind of notion is perhaps the very, very first step for education about values, about understanding values, about respecting values, about respecting others.
Okay, we started early, and I don't know if we have any more time for questions. Director Vin, maybe can we have a few more moments, or do we need to wrap up now?
You have, I mean, maybe 5 or 10 more minutes. So this.
Oh, excellent. Okay.
A few questions.
Okay, good.
For you.
Good. We could go on with this discussion forever, but so yeah, let's see. Ms. Suan's, sorry, this is from the moderator of the next session, Professor Aaron Beneville, who's also a NISM person, about the waning importance of the economics discourse in the 21st century. Someone needs to inform economists. So I guess that's a question, comment more than a question. Would you agree with that, Professor? Yes.
Oh, yes. I think there is a very good example in early childhood education. Early childhood education used to be the last on the list of the government agenda, because these are small kids and you don't need very able teachers, so they are kind of redundant. But with the effort of the early childhood educators, which is now the notion that it is very much understood across all disciplines. So even economists find out their own way of explaining why it is important. Sociologists explain why it is important, psychologists, and so on and so forth. So it becomes a matter of diffusion. My colleague, when I taught at Harvard, Carol Weiss, who unfortunately has passed away, has a notion that don't think that research can change policies. Policies can change only when there's a diffusion. Whole society understands, yes, this is important, this is important, this is important. And early childhood is very successful in doing that. All countries, all international organizations try to put more resources into early childhood because this is important in future. So I think we have to do some statement. NISM may be able to do a statement. Statement is almost an elevator conversation, right? You met an economist in the elevator, and the economist said that you are talking about values. Well, what do you think about? I'm an economist. I don't talk about values. So what do you say? What do you say? I think this is a test, but it's a real mission. Real mission. We have to make values visible, tangible, understandable, and not only a kind of echo chamber among ourselves. Yeah,
That's
yeah.
really important.
I know it is easier said than done. It's a long journey, but we have to
I
start.
think everything is easier said than done, I think. Yes. A question from John Yale to everyone. Will someone be speaking about the dynamic crisis of harmony of values learning versus hegemonic effect of economic drivers of globalization? I think maybe you've already touched on that. Any further thoughts on that?
No, that would be a different kind of discourse. It's a political discourse, which I wouldn't venture into.
Right.
Right.
So unless anyone has any other questions, maybe some of the other panelists. Yes.
Maybe I can say it's not about hegemony. Hegemony kind of assumes a power structure, but there are a lot is about understanding, about understanding the other cultures. Coming back to our earlier point, I think for the time being it is so important because a lot of conflicts now. When I was teaching at Harvard, it so happens that I know an Israeli girl, and also my teaching fellow was from the Palestine, and they all have a very, very vague idea what the other part is about.
Right.
And they will be, when they begin to talk to each other, it's very different. It's very different. Otherwise, it's a knot. You have to untie the knot by understanding each other. Otherwise, the knot will be tighter and tighter, tighter and tighter, generation after generation.
So I think perhaps the time has come to transfer to the next session. I'm glad that you brought up the whole term transversal competencies, because in my mind, I was not at all clear the difference between the 21st century skills and transversal competencies and how these terms interact with each other. So it's a good transition point to the next session, which is all about transversal competencies. I'd like to thank all of you. Thank you all of you for your wise insights and clarity of definition. So I think we're off to a very good start for the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.